Hello, everybody. Welcome, and of course, including everybody online, which is a good number I see. Lots of old friends, centre members, and some names I don't recognise. Welcome to you all, as to everybody in the room. So today, as you noticed, we are on a Wednesday, not on a Thursday. That's mainly because of the difficulty of getting seminar rooms on Thursday, but also we are at 4 o'clock and not 5 o'clock. And that's to help those people who need to get away from campus earlier than we might normally finish. One other difference to our format today, and that is we have two papers on the theme of religion and multiculturalism, where standardly we just have one presentation, and usually we have a visiting speaker, and this time we've got two of our own people, and we'll be doing that across the year this year, because we've got a little bit disconnected with each other due to the pandemics, people working at home more obviously, and so on. So as a way of getting to know each other again and getting to know new people and sharing our work with each other, we're going to combine the usual visiting speakers series with internal presentations and discussions of today being one of them. So today I'm very pleased that we've got Katya, Braginskaia, and Thomas Seeley. I'll introduce them briefly, and then they'll have about 25 minutes, 30 minutes for their presentations. Then we'll take the two presentations together and have a collective discussion after that, which can perhaps go up to about 5:30, when we'll say goodbye to our Zoom colleagues. But for the rest of us, there are some drinks available outside in the cafe area. So to introduce today's speakers, Katya is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow and Honorary Senior Research Associate at the Centre. Her academic interests include comparative approaches to minority faith and civic activism, religious pluralism and integration. Her current research is entitled Minority Faith and Civil Society Responses to Refugee Integration in Britain. Previously, she worked on the Public Faith and Finance project in the school with Therese O'Toole, and also contributed to the AHRC-funded Connected Communities project in the School of Education. Before coming to Bristol, she worked on the ESRC-funded project Radicalization and Violence, the Russian Dimension, at the University of Edinburgh. She's published on the Muslim Council of Britain and its engagement in British politics, and on the processes of institutionalization and representation of Islam in Russia. Thomas is lecturer in ethnicity and race and member of this centre. He teaches, researches, and has published on multiculturalism, secularism, and the governance of religious diversity, racism, Islamophobia, and converts to Islam. Most recently, he's contributed to and co-edited 2 special issues with me on global comparative perspectives. One on racisms and anti-racisms, and one on the governance of religious diversity as part of the International Greece project, which also provides the basis for an upcoming book project that we are working on. His monograph on multiculturalism and converts to Islam is published with Palgrave and is where the ideas presented here today begin, he says. So, over to you, Katya.
All right, thank you, Tariq, for the introduction. It's great to be back in Bristol and to share some of my research. So today I want to present on some of the findings from my research about minority and civil society organizations, and particularly to look at the ways in which they participate in welcoming and assisting refugees and asylum seekers in Britain. And my special emphasis and I have sort of attention here is to how Muslim and Jewish groups negotiate and co-create a sense of belonging for newcomers in the wider society, acting in some ways as relatively settled minority hosts. So some of these ideas are still work in progress, and I will welcome your feedback and comments. So just a bit of background and context. This is part of my bigger project in which I explore how ethno-religious minorities participate in social integration of refugees and asylum seekers in England and Scotland, and develop multicultural forms of citizenship in belonging. Particularly, my interest is here in the domain of organized civil society. So I've done about just over 40 interviews in London, Edinburgh, and Glasgow, but also some in Birmingham and some in Toronto. The kind of organizations I've contacted were mainly places of worship, umbrella community groups, interfaith, and refugee sponsorship groups. So most of the fieldwork was conducted before the pandemic, I have to say. So I kept sort of following some of the work of these organizations during COVID, and also some of the ongoing efforts to campaign against things like hostile environment. So the notion of hospitality, and that's what sort of I'm primarily focusing here, is used in migration and refugee studies to explore some of the inclusionary and exclusionary dynamics of welcome, sometimes in relation to humanitarian, faith-based organizations or host-guest relations in the different contexts. And I guess here I'm thinking about some of the works by Eleanor Fiddian-Qasmiyeh about refugee hosts, and also edited volumes, things like Sacred Welcomes, for example, of course, as well as many, many others. In terms of theological accounts and the scholarship, some of the studies examine how hospitality is conceptualized and articulated in various religious traditions in terms of interfaith encounters, but also including hospitality as a lived practice. And I guess if we look at multiculturalism, and sort of my focus here, and I guess what particularly interests me here, is multicultural approaches to integration and citizenship, and in terms of how they engage with recognizing collectivities and accommodating multiple ways of belonging in the public sphere. So it's about creating spaces where positive differences are expressed, not flattened, to use Tariq Modood's phrase, and where belonging, to quote from Biko Perek, is about being accepted and feeling welcome. And so, in some ways, thinking about Tariq Modood's vision of multicultural citizenship that is not confined to the state, but dispersed across society, compatible with multiple forms of groupness, and also the idea of hospitality as in some ways envisaged by Luke Bretherton as a civic interface and non-state centric practice. And I think those sort of ideas provide a good meeting point to talk about how minority-based hospitality unfolds in the domain of organized civil society. So I suggest that this multiculturally grounded, or at least I hope inspired, approach can help explore some of the mediated forms of minority-based hospitality as articulations of ethno-religious and civic identities. And in particular, I want to look at the two narratives, sort of to look at accommodation and vulnerability, which can be both seen as rooted in difference and universality, as well as sort of dialogical nature of host-guest relations. So let me look first at accommodation. Acts and practices of hospitality, of course, come in different forms and shapes and sizes, and including activities to assist refugees and asylum seekers with welfare provision or trying to tackle social exclusion. So including things like running a food bank in a mosque or organizing a drop-in center in a synagogue, taking part in community sponsorship group activities, trying to welcome a refugee family. And I want to sort of, make a point that these acts and practices are not about seeking accommodation from the state for themselves, for communities themselves, but rather it's about trying to develop inclusive organizational practices to accommodate the needs and entitlements of others. So here the migrants are the newcomers, regardless of their religious or cultural affiliation. So instead of segregating from society, which is a criticism often directed at some Muslim, but also Jewish Orthodox groups in negative public representations, minority faith and civil society organizations often work together with other organizations to improve services and trying to co-create sort of more dialogical sense of belonging. And I think a multicultural character of these actions is further shaped by religious and civic principles, experiences of migration heritage, or racialized experiences of welcome and exclusion. So for example, the groups often talk about giving the same hospitality to newcomers as they receive themselves, or quite often would like to have received. In Abrahamic traditions of welcoming strangers, there is this sort of idea of relational aspect of hospitality. Kaplan, for example, notes that in Jewish tradition, identification with strangers in a strange land not only constitutes an act of solidarity with Jews, but also establishes solidarity with oppressed people. And some of the respondents that I interviewed often use the religious discourses to explain why their organizations engages in refugee work, or how, for example, they mobilize support of their members. And for example, a Muslim respondent who was trying to improve participation from Muslim organizations in community sponsorship program to resettle Syrian refugees, noted that, talking about his faith, that our narrative is found in scripture. And it is in the Islamic tradition that there is a strong thread around refugees. So that our starting point is often allowing people to reflect on that first. But of course, religious and civic motivations often become entangled, highlighting their pluralist and often multiple forms of self-identification, as well as experiences of lived religion. As was quite nicely put by one of the volunteers from a Muslim umbrella organization, the essence of my religion is to help others, so to give back to society. When you try to integrate, it's not easy. And it's really important that we're able to be that bridge for someone who is coming into a completely new society. And I will come back to that idea of bridge or the lack of bridge, quite often the barrier later on. But often opening one's premises, physical premises, or sort of more figuratively hearts and minds to others as part of hospitality can also come with certain expectations and power asymmetries. And of course, this is a tension which is quite well captured by Derrida's idea of conditional versus unconditional hospitality. And this can affect minority groups offering hospitality just as hosts from majority-based organizations versus mainstream society. And so I think it's basically in this sort of context, hospitality can become a form of benevolence, manifesting itself often through paternalistic rhetoric of organizations acting as already settled citizens, and often acting as sort of co-opted partners by the state or local authorities, and reproducing in some ways national majoritarian narratives of belonging. And ultimately with integration then becoming almost this desired outcome of the conditional hospitality. For example, one group I interviewed complained about the refugees whom they were supporting not integrating by forming their own little groups, or for example, resisting the group efforts to provide English lessons, and preferring to speak in Arabic. And interestingly, in his piece about Islamic narratives and practices of hospitality, the Here is a Man, for example, calls for transformation of the stranger from being a guest to becoming a neighbor, and ultimately enjoying more reciprocal relations. And in my research, some groups reflected on this need to counteract colonial relationships between those offering hospitality and those receiving, and in some ways trying to empower their guests by be it creating employment opportunities or just some sort of simple things of trying to give something back, for example, like singing in a synagogue choir, or sharing a meal, or trying to provide any sort of other sets of services or goods. So rather than just sort of going back to some of the neoliberal thinking, rather than just filling the gaps in the refugee services, some Muslim and Jewish organizations adopted a more critical stance towards state policies, campaigning to renegotiate terms and conditions for what it takes or what it involves being a refugee or an asylum seeker in the UK. So this sort of involved pushing often back against Islamophobia and negative attitudes towards newcomers. And in some ways, this represents an attempt to redress the balance and to create a more positive accommodation of difference, which in this case is being mediated and sort of formed on behalf of newcomers. And this was formulated quite movingly by a member of a Shia organization. It's quite a lengthy quotation, but I'll read it. We are looking at making sure that everyone has equal opportunity. Islamophobia and racism can be a real barrier. When you come across or work with Muslim community groups who found a way to navigate through those spaces and are able to share some of those best practices with refugee communities, that's really powerful. So here is creating a narrative of putting themselves in the middle of that process. Other examples included Muslim and Jewish groups campaigning against hostile environment and inbuilt injustices of nationality and borders bills, or trying to campaign against the plans to sort of more recently to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda. And sometimes these actions were framed with reference to collective identities, as was noted in the petition by one of the Jewish organizations trying to create support and trying to fight against the deportations. And it's quite an interesting sort of way of the way they put it, saying that this appalling policy, referring to deportation, flies in the face of Jewish values and cannot be done in our community's name. So here adopting quite a sort of collective sense of identity, trying to address an injustice. In his theory of feminist hospitality, Maurice Hamilton, for example, suggests that hospitality is a performative act of identity. To give comfort or make welcome to the strangers, a host must act. And it is in the process of this action that the host is instantiating identity. So here, I think in these sort of acts of hospitality towards newcomers, in some ways can be seen as an expression of minority group identities, grounded in hybrid sort of experiences of difference and universality. So far I talked of sort of more positive aspects and the positive accommodation of difference. But I think there are also, it's important to note some of the more negative aspects, such as vulnerability. So although acts of hospitality can create quite empowering experiences, there could also be some elements of insecurity and discrimination. But I think sort of, scholars in hospitality, of course, note that hospitality is not without risk. And sometimes this risk that can stem from perhaps less than perfect encounters, as well as some political and systemic factors, such as hostile environment or securitization. I think in migration studies, actually, there's a use of vulnerability label in relation to refugees and asylum seekers often disputed. For example, in works by Yeo or Smith and Waite. And this is because it deprives sort of newcomers of their agency, and it creates quite a dangerous distinction between deserving and undeserving migrants, obscuring some of the sort of systemic oppression. But I wonder if perhaps in relation to hosts, this idea of vulnerability can have or maybe regain some of its salience. And particularly if we talk about hosts from minority communities whose own position in society is often subject to discrimination and exclusion. So perhaps these narratives then can be suggestive in some ways of multicultural understanding of negative difference. So things like exclusion, discrimination, a sense of injustice, which can be experienced internally by the group, but also imposed externally or perceived as a negative representation or stigmatization. So I want to look at two examples of what happens when some of these differences cannot be perhaps readily transformed into more positive civic action. So my first illustration is, it's more to do with vulnerabilities that can emerge from within the group. For example, during my interviews with Jewish organizations in London, I found lots of really sort of successful and well-run initiatives of drop-in centers for refugees and asylum seekers, which involve groups working together in joint ways, particularly within the liberal and Reform Judaist traditions. But I was also struck by an initiative by an Orthodox community who set up a drop-in center in their synagogue. They were sort of quite late coming to the scene, but they wanted to follow in steps of some other initiatives. And this was organized as part of the social action, and it ended by being quite a positive experience, though difficult. And what was difficult particularly was about building trust with their guests, but also trusting themselves to take a risk. And the risk was particularly involved with the fact that they were sort of feeling suspicious about the migrants who were going to, or asylum seekers from Muslim background who were going to come and be welcomed in their holy space and their place of worship. So some of this reflected some of the inbuilt fears, perhaps, or misperceptions. There were also some slightly more discouraging examples when, for example, also a Jewish group in Glasgow wanted to assist refugees and asylum seekers, but they lacked, on one hand, sort of organizational capacity, so their efforts were not as successful of that particular group as they would have liked. And also, I think what didn't work, that not many people actually turned up to have lunch, for example, inside of that, in the synagogue. And so here, sort of hospitality then tends to be often as being seen, as I mentioned earlier, as a bridge, as the idea of building bridges between communities, but in some ways it can also work as a barrier. And the sort of failed attempts, such as, for example, organizing an event, can have quite an opposite effect. So in the words of one community leader, instead of building bridges, this created psychological barriers. So I think some of this vulnerability was to do with sort of limited organizational capacity and perhaps slightly shrinking Scottish Jewish community in Scotland. But they were also frustrated, sort of these collective efforts to mobilize internally were also frustrated by a degree of negative stereotyping and some interreligious challenges. So, and my second example is more to do with vulnerability, which can be expressed as sort of an imposed difference from outside. And some of it came out in research with Muslim organizations in England, who expressed some of concerns about securitized dimensions of such sort of refugee welcoming initiatives as community sponsorship scheme. And particularly what was concerning for them is a requirement to undergo prevent duty training as part of the safeguarding policy. And because it was sort of expected to, also part of the policy was to expect to report any concerns about the potential radicalization of the refugees who were welcoming. So of course introduced back in 2015, and prevent as a duty for public sector bodies, including charities, and has created quite a sort of unwelcome scrutiny and stigmatization of Muslim communities. And while some groups I've interviewed perhaps saw it just as a regulatory hurdle that they had to engage with and they had to overcome, others voiced some fears that the way that policy sort of operates and the fact that they have to sign these documents and act and do the prevent training would sort of reflect negatively on their community as a way of keeping tabs in some ways. So for example, one person noted that what happens if mosques are viewed unfavorably if they put themselves forward as a community sponsor, and because of this greater scrutiny and, for example, like things like extremism. And another noted that mosques were often concerned and worried about the wrong actions of the person they might sponsor, of the family, how then it will reflect back on their community and how it will create further tensions. And in some ways, these narratives show that increased securitization of integration initiatives supposedly designed to create more sort of welcoming environment rather than a discriminating environment for newcomers, can actually have quite unhospitable consequences for minority groups who are mediating these experiences, often feeding into existing narratives and perceptions of vulnerability and discrimination, and reinforcing negative difference and the sense of alienations for hosts from Muslim communities. Back in 2020, independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration recognized some of the exclusionary character of the provision and wrote that the Home Office should deal directly with real or perceived concerns of prospective groups, such as a requirement for Muslim groups to complete prevent training. But of course, it's difficult to see the extent to which this can be implemented in practice. So I guess in conclusion, a multicultural approach to mediated forms of hospitality, as constructed and negotiated by ethno-religious minorities, provides a useful lens to unpack some of these inclusionary and exclusionary narratives to welcome and belonging. Multiple ways of in which organizations often enact hospitality demonstrates a certain fluidity between majority and minority categories, but also between guests and hosts sort of collective identities. The boundaries can become blurred if negative differences are transformed into positive accommodation, for example, through more reciprocal kind of relations. But also it could be the opposite effect. It can get reinforced by reproducing exclusionary narratives of, for example, being quite paternalistic or benevolent. And also, I think multicultural hospitality, perhaps as a performative act of minority group identities, becomes in some ways self-reflexive and dialogical process, which problematizes minority hosts' organizational capacity and own sense of belonging or unbelonging host nation.
Thank you, Katya. Over to you, Cummins. Yeah, I think that's probably over.
I'll press the wrong button and turn it all off. Yeah. It was an accident. I'm lazy, so I'm going to half sit down. Okay, so thank you very much. And I think other than the title of this session, this kind of idea of multicultural missions and developments that brings together mine and Katya's papers. There's another link here, which is this notion of hospitality that we're both drawing on and using. And focus, what I want to talk about is, what I want to do in this talk is bring this kind of notion of hospitality to bear on multiculturalism and what multiculturalism has to say about public religion. It will be, I'm sure, no surprise to anybody, or not news to anybody, the issues of public religion in Western Europe and in Britain, and Britain is kind of the context I've kind of got most in mind throughout the rest of what I've got to say. But the issues of public religion have in various ways been important aspects of public and political and scholarly debate for quite a while now. Controversies have abounded over religious dress, issues of free speech, gender and sexuality, the 26 Lord's Spiritual, when the Archbishop tries to make critical interventions in relation to government policies, and I can never resist having a quick dig at Richard Dawkins' desperate attempts to become some kind of celebrity. But of course, many, many more as well. These are just kind of a few of the various things that happened over the years. In relation to kind of scholarship that thinks about religion in this sense and the role and place of religion in the public sphere, well, I think one thing we can see is a kind of a shift to a kind of a more accommodative stance of rethinking how we think about religion in a kind of a public sense. Rawls and Habermas famously shifted their positions in this kind of direction. And I think in kind of Cecile Labord's kind of recent and important influential book has kind of reconceptualized these kind of issues in relation to liberalism and religion in this kind of direction. But one of the most distinctive voices in these debates has been that which has emerged from what has recently been termed the Bristol School of Multiculturalism. And kind of most notably, perhaps, by one of the central figures here, which is our host, our MC for this evening. And when I kind of use the shorthand term multiculturalism throughout the rest of this, this is what I'm kind of really referring to, and kind of the Bristol School. And why is this? Well, Jeff Levy, in bringing the Bristol School as a term into being, he noted that one of the distinctive features of the Bristol School in relation to other liberal multiculturalisms was the Bristol School's focus on religious identity groups and not just ethnic and cultural groups. Liberal multiculturalists, Levy says, tend to equivocate on the place of religious groups. And that one of the key features that the Bristol School brings here is this kind of concept of ethno-religious, in kind of focusing more, also focusing on religious groups. And so we might say that the Bristol School here is distinctive in what we might call a kind of religion-friendly direction. But what I want to explore and kind of in this paper is that while I agree with Levy, I think that the Bristol School is also in fact equivocal on the place of religion as such. But what I want to do is suggest how this is so, and that is where the notion of hospitality comes in. I should also say though, that as someone who himself is quite happy to come under and work within this kind of Bristol School of Multiculturalism notion, I'll also suggest that multicultural has some resources to address what I'm going to kind of claim as some shortcomings and the kind of developments that might be interesting and necessary in relation to the various kind of aspects and debates that are going on here. So let's start by saying something about why, what is it? Some of the kind of reasons why this kind of form of multiculturalism is distinctive here in a kind of religion-friendly direction, and why I therefore think it's kind of quite right that we interrogate this claim and these kind of aspects a little bit further. So the first and possibly the most important or foundational kind of concept here is that of recognition and recognition of difference. So to quote Tariq and Modood, multiculturalism struggle, the political mobilization, but also the policy and institutional outcomes to the forms of accommodation in which differences are not eliminated, are not washed away, but are to some extent recognized. And this kind of basis gets applied to thinking about religion in particular through various writings around this idea of moderate secularism. And as moderate secularism as preferable to kind of more exclusionary, or what Tariq has called radical secularisms, think kind of laïcité in France and this kind of stuff. And a few of these kind of important features here, our arguments here, are one, the idea of mutual autonomy. So religious authority is subordinate to political authority, but there is a decent degree of autonomy here, and the state isn't overly interfering, overly controlling of kind of religion. Religion is a public good, not just a private good. And that as such, it is legitimate for the state to be involved in eliciting the public good that comes from religion. So it's not just about religion as a private thing for individuals, and it's not just about protecting people against the dangers of religion or potential harms, but there is a good to be had here that is important. So this is kind of going here. Now what I want to do is bring in a kind of the hospitality, and as a kind of a parallel but separate development to recognition, and then kind of bring the two and then kind of read them against each other a little bit. And this notion of hospitality I draw from the work of some political theologians. And as a quick point of clarification, when I use political theology here, I do not mean this in the kind of Schmittian sense, but in relation to thinkers who bring a theological orientation and position to thinking about politics. Luke Bretherton, who's kind of quite prominent here, he's phrased this kind of orientation in the question in this way. So Bretherton says that a question central to political theology is how can I keep faith with my distinctive commitments while also forming a common life with neighbours who have a different vision of life to me? And this is where the notion of hospitality comes in for Bretherton, as well as kind of others. So in many ways, it's a very old concept. And we've seen a bit of this from Katya in terms of various places that you find it. It's old theologically, but also philosophers have discussed it in various ways. It's found throughout religious studies in relation to different religious traditions. But I think the kind of way of thinking about it of most direct relevance here is how it's been articulated by political theologians such as Luke Bretherton in response to this question that he's just posed. And Bretherton is perhaps one of the people who's written the most on this. I say it's kind of there's some parallels here. It's developed in some ways in parallel to the idea of recognition that we find in multiculturalism, albeit separate. Because what is also evident from the question that Bretherton asks is that it seeks some recognition of difference, that difference is taken seriously. It's not seen as a problem, but is central to thinking about how we can live together, how we relate to others, how we build a common life, and so on across this difference. And in this way, it is also as multiculturalism's recognition set against liberalism and the kind of traditional reliance on tolerance that we find there. And in this vein, Kevin Shilbrack has referred to it as a conceptual revolution in the ethics of religious diversity. But what's significant about this, in kind of despite this kind of parallels and these overlaps, is precisely that hospitality alerts us to this kind of specificity of thinking about religious subjecthood and concentrates us on the religious issue here. The significance of hospitality lies in part in the fact that it is thoroughly theological, that it's a call to act and be a certain way, a way of relating to others across difference in a plural society, where that relationship to others is also a reflection of the relationship to the divine. Jonathan Chaplin, who I think I saw on there, if he's still here, so he'll be popping up throughout this, and if I butcher anything, I'm sure he'll correct me. But he has argued that it is sheer sentimentality to deny the existence of these deep differences of belief among rival religions. The suppression of religious differences is a recipe not for tolerance, but for mutual disrespect. And we can add in, I think, non-religious positions here too. So what I want to do now then is kind of bring some of this to bear on kind of multiculturalism's way of thinking about recognition, and to kind of look at some of these kind of omissions or blind spots, and then some developments that I think might be interesting. And I'm going to do this in relation to two kind of main ways. So kind of recognition in relation to identity, so ethno-religious identities, and then recognition in relation to this idea of institutional connections and the state engaging with religious organizations and this kind of thing. So, as I've said, multiculturalism relies on conceiving identity in ethno-religious terms, largely stemming from kind of roots in thinking coming out of anti-racism concerns. And in this, along these kind of lines, Tariq, as an example, has talked about humans as cultural beings, but nowhere is this extended really to thinking about humans as religious beings. The issue of identities for multiculturalism remains one that is rooted in communities of descent. Now, I have no problem with the ethno-religious notion itself and what it accomplishes in terms of anti-racism, but thinking about religion more specifically, I think there's an issue in part because it tends to collapse the religious into the ethnic, where the religious part almost becomes a proxy for the ethnic. And this doesn't necessarily fit neatly with religious identity, or certainly how many people of faith think about that. It has been argued, for example, that religion can be a deeper formative force than cultural ethnicity, even though it's certainly shaped by them. And what this begins to indicate is we need some kind of greater analytical attention to what is distinct about religion and ethnicity here, even as they kind of are mutual influences. And I think to not do this runs a real risk of to bring a bit of Taylor's famous essay into play, that we risk foreshortening the reality being studied in relation specifically to the religious. But this is not any exclusive theological argument. We find these things in sociological research as well, which also suggests the need for some greater analytical care and clarity here. Numerous studies have argued that religious identity is understood as qualitatively different from other identity categories. And even in much work that religious identity might be the most, it's just not one part, but is the most significant aspect. But as well as this, it's also conceived differently. So other identity categories become enveloped or come underneath the religious, which cautions against a general way of seeing religious as one category that sits alongside others or is ranked in some hierarchical fashion or something like this. And mirroring some of what we just saw on the previous slide, there's this argument from Beckford that, yes, there are clear overlaps between aspects of religion and aspects of ethnicity. But it is important that religion should not be completely collapsed into that of ethnicity and vice versa. So these are some of what's going on here in terms of needing to think about how we think about religious identity a bit differently in relation to multiculturalism's deceptions. But there's a further reason why this is important, which is also suggested in that quote. And that is that this makes a difference. This is significant for approaches to policy development. And in fact, Jonathan Chaplin again has noted, he quotes a report that found that the Charity Commission, and the Charity Commission, just for anybody who doesn't know, one of the charitable purposes under which you can gain charitable status is the advancement of religion, and lots of churches and religious organisations are registered as charities under this. But what this report that he quotes finds is that the construal of this idea of the advancement of religion that the Charity Commission work with is very, very different from how people of faith actually understand it themselves. So there's a a disjuncture here. And the significance of this, thinking about this sense of institutional connections, is what the next bit that I want to look at in terms of this idea of recognition. And that I think what it does is it asks us to interrogate the terms of these state-religion connections to a much more critical way. So again, Bretherton, along the similar lines, multiculturalism recognises that the kind of state-religion partnerships that are set up they can positively increase the role and visibility of faith organisations in society as part of the public good. This is to be welcomed, and this is a good thing. However, he also cautions that to enter into such partnerships with the state often means that the religious organisations themselves have to mimic secular organisations through processes of what he refers to as institutional isomorphism. And that this can distort the faith groups themselves and serve to depoliticize them. And so he goes on to identify these roles and these relationships as reductive and instrumentalist processes of this nice little alliterative phrase, co-option, competition, and commodification. So this is to say that the religious aspect, the religious ethos, is restricted to the background by certain conditions set upon their present scope and activity in the public sphere and in these connections and relations with the state. And to quote a report along these lines that was jointly produced by the British Academy and the think tank Theos, and that was written by Madeline Pennington even, it says that the distinctiveness of faith ethos in faith provision is often overlooked, or where it is acknowledged, often treated only in a negative sense. So even in these state religion connections, the idea of religion as a public harm or danger that needs to be cautioned against is what seems to come out more strongly than the kind of actual public, than the public good aspect. And this restricts any kind of distinctive or critical constructive roles the church and other religious organizations can play in society and politics. And just kind of, I suppose, some of the scale of this, Adam Dinham, who from a sociological point of view has written about this kind of faith organizations and kind of connections, he's kind of suggested that such is the presence and reliance on faith organizations for welfare provision in these connections, that if we were to cut religious organizations out of this, that the welfare provision would collapse. The state relies on it, and yet the way in which it engages with them is kind of very restrictive in this sense. So this is a potential problem. And kind of thinking back in terms of multiculturalism and kind of recognition here, another way we could put this is that, again, there's a risk that these forms of recognition, which I think multiculturalism has taken a little bit for granted, or perhaps certainly considering more critical depth, but there's a risk here that these forms of recognition might, in fact, be forms of non-recognition or misrecognition, in which to kind of draw in a bit of Taylor again, that kind of produce a false, distorted and reduced mode of being for the kind of the faith organizations and their kind of ethos and motivations themselves. So the argument here then is that the current situation, and this is one that Chaplin makes again, so the current situation is much more one of the state permitting or admitting faith-based organizations into the public sector. But what we actually should be aiming for is one that is more about the state supporting and integrating them. One that enables them to retain rather than distorts the kind of critical voice they can bring and the positive role that religious faith can play in the public sphere, precisely because of the religious orientations, rather than trying to cut that out. And that this might kind of contribute towards a more kind of equal society in this regard. Bretherton has in fact cautioned the church about partnering with the state and calls the church to interrogate the conditions of such partnerships for these kinds of reasons. And in Chaplin's book published earlier this year, he makes a case from a political theological position for disestablishment, and this is part of the reason for that. So there's like the kind of idea of mutual autonomy kind of put under the microscope here a little bit. So Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, of course, has said that what is lacking in these kind of arrangements is a crowded and argumentative public square in which religious convictions are granted a public hearing and debate, not necessarily one in which they're privileged or regarded as beyond criticism, but one in which they are tended to as representing the considered moral foundation of the choices and priorities of citizens. And I think the strengths of hospitality here is precisely that it's a concept more at home with addressing and thinking about the kind of discursive disadvantage of kind of religious citizens or organizations, including religious minorities, face through these kinds of relationships and arrangements. So what, in sum, I can kind of want to suggest is that there's a few points here which I think open up some kind of vistas of kind of multicultural missions, but also places for development. But as I said, places where I think multiculturalism itself has the scope to kind of draw some of this in and make some interesting things, or say some interesting things here. So the first one, of course, is this conceptualization of identity that we've talked about. But of course, a principle of multiculturalism, in a way, it develops its own sense of ethno-religious, or this kind of notion of ethno-religious identity, is based on this kind of principle of being even-handed between identity categories when they express a sense of self and social location. So there's a basic principle here, which I think can be built on, but above that, there's some kind of, I think, some reconceptualization that's needed. The second one relates to what we've just been talking about, so the critical view and a greater critical view and interrogation of state-religion connections in relation to this idea of eliciting the public good, how religion is actually seen here, what's actually imposed here, and whether these kind of organizations are seen as part, critical friend as part of this, or whether it's kind of simply about kind of utilising resources to provide services that the state is unwilling or unable to provide itself. And I think particularly in relation to kind of William's quote, the place of religious language and reason kind of gets opened up here. And this is something that has been a big part of the literature for liberal thinkers. Jonathan Chaplin, again, is a political theologian who has said, has discussed this, but something Multiculturalism hasn't said a lot directly about. But I think it could. Again, there's a strong dialogical component or even multilogical component, which it can kind of draw on here, and particularly because this brings up the issue of literacy. So when we think about arguments around religious language and reason, there's a sense in which this is often talked about as an epistemological issue, when we can also think about it as a thoroughly sociological issue, insofar as it's about religious literacy. It's about what we can do, are willing to understand and accommodate, be open to listening to and engaging with. And here I think there's some kind of multicultural resources that can be brought to bear here. So in many ways, this only gets me kind of halfway, because I'm suggesting some developments, but I'm actually doing them, because unfortunately I've run out of time, and because that's about as far as I've got. I'm hoping to kind of take these on in a couple of things I've got coming up, but so this is kind of about picking up something that I've been thinking about, and would like to try and see if I can take it further, and any comments for that would be most welcome. I think that's my time.
As no one's rushing to ask a question, I'll take up the challenge. So that's a very interesting presentation, and of course I've read some of the your own writing that it's based on, above all your book. So I want to see how far I can meet you by walking towards you, but of course to do that I first need to understand where you are. So, you know, it's a matter of trying to identify exactly what your position is, and for that matter where you think I am, so where I start the movement towards you. So I would say that the kind of the first part of what I might call my defense against your suggestion that there may be a misrecognition of religion going on is to say that I think the multiculturalism that I and other people that you refer to as the Bristol School have developed has got space for religion of the kind that you're appealing to. That is to say, religion as an ethos or a voice of its own, not reducible to something else like ethnicity, or what we might call mere culture, understanding that obviously religion is part of a comprehensive concept of culture. So as far as I can see it, I can accommodate that. But what is entirely true, and I don't make any apology for, is that I don't myself speak in or want to speak in a theological voice in the way that Luke Bretherton and Jonathan Chaplin do. So they begin with the New Testament. I begin with the concept of citizenship and what that implies for our ideas of difference, negative difference and positive difference. So I want to include what you refer to as religiosity, or the theological ethos. I want to include that within multiculturalism, both recognizing how it can be perceived as and treated as negative difference, and it clearly is. I mean, we've got a number of studies. One very good one is Stephen Jones's study that shows how a lot of liberal middle class British people are nervous, not so much about Muslims, but about Islam. And the only reason that perhaps working class people don't share that is because they don't know enough about Islam. But so I want to include that in my understanding of misrecognition and othering, and for that matter, racialization. At the same time, I want to include a positive recognition of that as well, recognition of that as a positive feature of our social, civic, and political landscape. When I say, for instance, that minority faiths should be brought into a relationship with the existing institutional arrangements that we refer to as church and state or establishment and so on. So that's the organized religion. It's not just Muslims, but at the same time, I do want to work with the concept of Muslims that is not reducible to their theological manifestation or their theological representation or traditions. So I want a concept of Muslim that will make sense of someone not being employed for a job that they've applied for because their employer thinks they're a Muslim and their employer has no idea what they believe in. Or a concept that can include, for instance, Serbian ethnic cleansing of Bosnian Muslims when they arrive in a village and round up people who they say are Muslims without asking anyone, oh, by the way, what do you believe in? Do you believe in Allah, or do you believe in, fasting and dawah and so on? So I want a concept of, Muslim, Jew, Hindu, Sikh, and so on, namely minority religious identities that are wider than their religious manifestation, but not excluding their religious manifestation. So that's where I think I stand. And I don't know how close or far that is to what you were saying.
I don't think it's that far. And I suppose inevitably, the bit of, if you're walking towards me, I'm going to be walking towards you as well. And maybe what you just said, I agree with, and I have no, I'm going to try and I've scribbled notes and I've got arrows going all over the place. So I'm going to see if I can make some sense of this and work through. Yes, there's work that needs to be done here. I know work of thinking that can articulate this stuff that needs to be done. Like I said, part of this is kind of the halfway point in that, or part of the halfway point in that sense. And partly this is because these kind of two things I can see parallels here, but there's also, they've developed separately and there's something distinct. So it's kind of getting that bit first and then, okay, now I need to do the work, I suppose. I think multicultural, try to say at the end, there's definitely space to accommodate this kind of stuff. But I think there's places where it needs development or needs, some stuff needs, and what I mean by that is not that what exists needs to be changed, that needs to be got rid of, done away with. But there's some of the purposes here. This brings up some kind of purposes and issues that are distinct, that can't be quite covered and captured. So that requires its own kind of form of development. And I also kind of wouldn't necessarily advocate, I wouldn't be looking to kind of speak with a theological voice. I'm not a theologian. I'm very kind of incompetent to speak with a theological voice. But I think if we're talking about accommodating religious organizations and religion and state, and we're talking about this specifically, then I think to kind of not take some account of theological voices and theological positions is a mistake. It seems to me to be an obvious kind of area where that's necessary. So take it, even if you kind of multiculturalism wouldn't speak in a theological voice itself, taking account of these voices seems to me to be important. That said, I have no problem at all with the ethno-religious thing, as I said. I think it's vitally important in relation to racism and anti-racism, and particularly in relation to these negatives that you kind of mentioned, some kind of different examples of. And of course, I know that you've kind of written that multiculturalism starts with negative difference and with the idea of then turning that into a positive claim for recognition. But I think here, I suppose, and that's definitely relevant in relation to religion in some cases. But even if you got rid of negative difference, even if there was no negative aspect here, there would still be, if we're thinking about religious identity, religious organization, faith, or whatever, there would still be a positive claim for recognition on that basis, even if there were no negative. There would still, precisely because of the kind of substantive nature of the difference we're talking about. So I think, you know, even if you had to,
Wouldn't that be true of ethnicity as well?
quite possibly, yeah.
I mean, it's entirely true that multiculturalism, as I understand it, you know, in our context, begins with negative difference. I entirely agree, but that's not to say that one couldn't have a positive recognition of ethno-cultural groups if they'd never been negativized, or if, say, we lived in a utopia and there was no stigmatization and othering. Still think there was a scope for a positive recognition. So that wouldn't be enough to distinguish it from, well, religion is something positive in its own right, which would be there and should be there and needs to be recognized regardless of whether or not it's being negativized. Because I think that would be true of other forms of identities as well.
Quite possibly. I think if the focus is accommodating, including faith organizations, religious citizens, and then to not distinguish, to not have a distinction when plenty of work, theological, sociological, says that we do need a more careful analytical distinction here. To not do that, I don't think that suggests that needs to be done and thought about and developed, whatever the outcome. But that there is something that needs to be analytically carefully considered and looked at. And I think, I mean, kind of the Stephen Jones thing as well. I mean, my reading of, it's kind of shifted my reading, but my reading of Stephen Jones now, I kind of think that he's, in relation to the negative thing, that he essentially kind of collapses. He's also kind of collapsing religion into race and ethnicity in the way he kind of thinks about Islamophobia and what's really going on here. Whereas others have kind of said there's an analytical distinction here between whether people's attitudes to Muslims as a group and people's attitudes to things like the headscarf and what that means. You know, there is an important analytical distinction where sometimes, and I think Stephen Jones has to kind of collapses one into the other, but that's not necessarily, I mean, I suppose people disagree on this, but I would kind of, that's certainly where I would go, that, you know, there is a distinction that's important here, and precisely because of this overlap with religion and ethnicity that it needs that kind of careful attention, I think. But I've talked a lot.
Okay, so I'll take one more question from the room, and then I'll turn to people online who've been very busy on the chat. I'll quickly look up the chat. But if you do have a question from online, perhaps you could actually indicate that by using the hand function, so that'd be quicker to see than to read through all the chats. But please go ahead and put your question.
Right. I want to give my own contribution from the third world perspective, for instance, in Africa. Right? Then when you look at identity, especially the religious identity, you find out that the ethnicity identity in you determines a lot in the force of your religion. And even within the religion themselves, there are still some elements of identity. So for instance, if we use Nigeria as an instance, even if there is a kind of hospitality for religious faith-based organizations, then the identity, individual ethnic identity inside faith-based organizations play a role on who gets what. So you find out that the ethnicity in them is more of a driving force than the religion. And whatever that kind of defines the religion is just your own belief system in the God, especially in the African countries where so many social services are not available. So everybody turns everything to God. So certain of those features may be lacking in the developed world. comparison of the two might not really work that well in terms of hospitality. I mean, if you bring in ethno-religion, religious identity inside it. And then I also got myself thinking during the time Dr. Katya was speaking on the hospitality and provisions for people you interviewed. Then I got myself asking that, because you mentioned accommodation for newcomers. Now, is there a way also of thinking, what can you also give back to those who are providing those things in terms of volunteering? What can you give back at that particular point? So is there things that you are willing to give back? Because within that hospitality period, it should be a period of building kind of a civic responsibilities. So if you are just relying on, I want accommodation, I want welfare, all those kind of things, when you get all those things, what are you giving to the society? Have you kind of trying to, kind of put yourself into that society so that you can give back to the society? So that becomes an issue on those giving things. But then, through your own presentation, I so much don't agree with some when it comes to those religious identity, because it might work for the West, but it might not even work more on the West. For instance, even in Nigeria, when you go to the mosque, which is Muslim, who becomes the imam depends on your identity. It's the same Muslim, it's the same mosque, they're all Muslim, but your opportunity to speak or even to preach is your identity. So first of all, they look at your identity first before your ethnic identity speaks first before your religious identity. Even in the Christian too. If you go to Pentecostalism in Nigeria, so what moves the church is ethnicity. So it's a tribe that determines first before you bring in the religious identity. So many of those things conflicts in some areas.
Okay, thank you. So in a way, given what was being said about hospitality, we'll start with you, Katya.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your comment. I think, yeah, it does raise an interesting question in terms of how ethnic and religious identities that people have actually interact within particular organizations. And I suppose maybe when I was trying to think in terms of how I approach the multicultural hospitality, sort of trying to conceptualize it, I'm thinking in terms of more middle ground level. So I'm not looking at top-down policy side of it, but I'm also looking less at individual everyday multiculturalism of everyday encounters. So my sort of interest is within that organizational field, organizational sort of level. But having said that, I think the issues that quite often comes out is when you speak to different members of organization, how do you then sort of see it not as a personal perspectives, but how do you make sure that you can take this perspective as an organizational position? Because quite sometimes I would say, as an organization, we do this, and it's quite clear. Sometimes you can think in terms of that what comes out are actually their own representations, can sometimes be influenced by more racial, ethnic self-identification or more religious beliefs. So there is this interesting interplay. And just to give an example, when I was interviewing, I had two individuals from a synagogue, for example. And when I was trying to probe a bit deeper in terms of their motivations to support refugees, and one person was very much talking in terms of religion. They were saying, this is my religion. And, based on that, that's what I do. And that's how I see our synagogue, our organization acting to support others, sort of drawing on faith motivations or social practices and sort of linking this together. And while this person was talking, the other one was sort of looking slightly in sort of more disbelief. Not that they're not religious, but for them, that wasn't the issue. That wasn't the main motivation. For them, it was much more about sort of humanitarian perspective, supporting, being more secular. And there is a sort of interplay between these different perspectives of how things unfold. And I think in relation to your second question about sort of accommodating and though being accommodated, giving something back, there is again a sort of interesting dynamic. On the one hand, it can be about empowering, and that's what some groups are trying to do, to make sure that they're not just giving, but people who receive hospitality or sort of being welcome, that they can contribute and they can give something back, and they feel more empowered. So they're not just sort of sitting there waiting for people to do something for them. But I suppose if you sort of turn this around as well, it could be seen as a sort of an extra expectation. Should hospitality be maybe more altruistic? Why are you expecting something back? Are you expecting something back for those sort of individuals to contribute to your organization? Or is it your way of making sure, that they feel that they can contribute? So it's a sort of a typical balance here.
Thanks. Did you want to pick up any of that?
I suppose not later, because I suppose what I'm talking about is thinking very much about Britain, and the contexts are very different, and I'm not competent enough to talk about other places and kind of how things work out there. But when you were talking, it kind of made me think of the number of years ago I worked in Muscat in Oman, and one of the things that struck me there was how often migrant workers were often treated appallingly, and many of them were Muslim. But often the kind of white, Western, rich expats, maybe Christian, maybe agnostic, maybe atheist, are treated much better than their co-religionists. So there's this, and hearing stories of in the mosques, a local would walk in, and if there were some Muslims from India praying, they'd get pushed to the back so that the local could pray closer to the front, and this kind of stuff. And there's kind of this kind of racialization going on, these hierarchies, where there's all this kind of stuff going on, and extremely blurred lines, and this will vary from context to context. And there's kind of even if I'm just thinking about Britain, the lines are blurred. Ethnicity, religion, and issues of racialization stuff, they're kind of all kind of overlapping, and they can never be fully pulled apart, and they shouldn't be fully pulled apart. But yeah, I suppose it's just about kind of careful analytical distinctions where we can make them, but yeah, context dependent totally. And I know nothing about the context you're talking about, so I can't say.
Okay, thanks. So we've got a question online, as you can see. Greg's got his hand up. So Greg, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Thomas and Katya your question?
Okay, thank you, Tariq, and thank you both
wait
speakers.
A second. Can't hear you. Maybe I have to unmute you as well. No, you've unmuted yourself.
I've unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Let's see. What's this? Can we hear you now?
Okay.
No.
And this is Razor's computer, and he's out of the room at the moment. I think he will be back in a moment. But you have unmuted yourself, and I've also unmuted you here, which actually
right. I think I was getting feedback.
Volume. That's a clever thought. Yes. Maybe the volume. I can't actually find the volume control. Maybe here. No.
Which speakers should it come out of the speakers here or the speakers on the laptop?
I don't know.
When I speak,
the keyboard. Volume's up here, so I don't know what's going on.
Okay, can you hear me?
Oh no, it's already up.
Maybe yes.
Oh no.
Can you hear me without feedback?
Let him know. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Tariq. Thank you, both speakers, for fine presentations, which were very stimulating. I want to go back to the first thing I put up in the chat, which was about hospitality in practice and whether you get a different perspective if you look beyond the individual religious organization, church or synagogue or whatever. And I come at that because I spend a lot of my time working within Preston City of Sanctuary, which is a fascinating organization because it brings together faith communities and individuals of faith from Christian, Muslim, Jewish and other backgrounds, people who are atheists, and organizations, statutory organizations and voluntary organizations, and increasingly refugee organizations. Now, I recognize that there are some evidence that there's a sort of what I call a differential hospitality, in that churches do tend to love to give hospitality to fellow Christians, particularly if they've come from an experience of persecution. And I'm not sure what it's like amongst the mosque, but I'd be interested to know if you picked any of this up in the research on hospitality and asylum. And I'd be interested to know what the implications of this, in a sense, super diversity. It is not totally straightforward, but I think in City of Sanctuary, we would go with the idea that we share some common values around hospitality, whatever faith communities we come from. And it's interesting that Linda Woodhead, in her thinking and lectures recently, has been talking about values as the new religion. So I just throw those in and sort of see what sort of response you might have.
Okay, thanks. Do you want to begin, Katya?
Yeah, okay. Yes, thank you. Echoing across the room. Not anymore. Yes.
I think you're all right. Thank you, Dan.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the comments. I'm just thinking in terms of things to pick up. I mean, I did find examples of collaborative work and working in joint ways and trying to establish more connections and dialogue within the groups and between the groups. And I think this was particularly sort of relevant for example, welfare provisions in terms of working together with other groups for food bank, for example, trying to use each other's sort of services, which in my research I sort of linked back to some of that dialogical dynamic within multiculturalism, trying to work in more connected ways. In terms of differentiated hospitality and just providing for more for your own community and co-religionists, there are some groups who do that. But what was, I think, particularly interesting is that some organizations wanted to repeat in terms of how they were presenting themselves, that their services are open for everybody and anybody, you know, regardless of their religion or sort of cultural affiliation, and they were willing sort of to welcome and provide for those groups. I think when I did some of my interviews in Toronto, because I wanted to research more this idea of community sponsorship, which sort of almost emerged, I guess, from the Canadian context, and then was more developed now in Britain. There were some stories about, because of course the private sponsorship scheme is much more developed there, and there were some stories about groups just wanting to welcome, for example, particular refugees, particular Christians, for example, from in relation to the Syrian conflict, wanting to welcome either the Christian minority groups or maybe the Yazidis rather than sort of Muslim groups. So there was some anecdotal evidence, of course, so far of that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe I could go back to this issue about hospitality and its relationship to recognition. So, as Thomas said, and as is very evident in your presentations, hospitality is a shared concept for the two of you. So, having said something by way of defense of where I am, let me now say something about what I see as the weakness of the concept of hospitality in trying to do some of the work that you wanted to do. So, as I think you noted, Katya, at least implicitly, hospitality is a very important concept in a number of cultures across the world, and in particular Muslim cultures, but not only, also Jews and Christians and so on. But hospitality is a temporary relationship. In many cultures, hosts are given very strong obligations to be hospitable to their guests. I mean, some of you will remember that in September 2001,
after the 9/11 attacks, when George Bush said, surrender Osama bin Laden to us, or we're going to, bomb you into the Stone Age. The Taliban replied, well, we can't. He's a guest. And now you might think, oh, well, that's just political nonsense. But actually, there is a culture that you have to protect those who have accepted your hospitality, i.e. those who are your guests. But first of all, it's an unequal relationship. There's no sense of equality between host and guest. How can there be? This is your country, and the host has walked into it, and it's a temporary relationship. And thirdly, and this relates to the question that you were raising right at the end, you mentioned this, I think, in relation to Nigeria. It's a relationship not of direct symmetrical reciprocity, but it creates something, should create, normatively, should create something in the guest, at the very least, gratitude. Now, a lot of people, certainly in migration studies, think that gratitude is an inappropriate normative concept to use in migration studies and in relation to migration policies and so on. Unlike some politicians who do think the migrants ought to be grateful. So for those three reasons, namely the relationship inequality, secondly, that's a temporary relationship, and thirdly, that it creates strong normative obligations of gratitude. That's three particular reasons why I think recognition is much more fitted for multicultural equality. Why didn't you pick that up, Thomas? Well, you can start if you already were ready.
Yes, I was. It's a very good point you're making about hospitality being temporary character, and in fact, in literature about hospitality, that's been picked up quite a lot. So in a way, hospitality then it becomes a mechanism. I think it was the idea that it's a mechanism for contact rather than integration. So when I focused on hospitality, in some ways, I started my research thinking about integration and citizenship and how minority faith groups actually engage in these processes. But as some of this integration practices and acts are quite imperfect in some ways, and I think exactly because we're not going far enough, or they were temporary, or there would be, there would be the need to keep supporting, for example, a refugee family. But the idea of community sponsorship is that works just for a year or 2 years, and then sort of more on your own. And then I thought the ideas of hospitality.
Sorry, not that you're on your own after that, but you have to leave. The guest has to leave under conditions of hospitality. Hospitality is not indefinite, so the guest has to cease to be a guest, usually by departing.
But usually the guest can return. There's nothing precluding the guest to come back.
I think you can become an unwanted guest if you keep coming back.
But you can also
coming to stay with me for a couple of days, right? Very quickly, she'll go on.
you can also be an unwanted host if the sort of reception you're providing is quite asymmetrical in terms of sort of power relations. And I think initially when we were thinking about co-presenting and trying to see where we overlap in terms of multiculturalism and hospitality, I have a feeling that sort of we ended up with Thomas talking about hospitable multiculturalism and me talking more about trying to think of ways to multiculturalize in some ways idea of hospitality, and particularly doing it by focusing on how minority faith groups who have already experienced asymmetrical power relations and sort of more complex ways of receiving hospitality can perhaps improve this for others. So that's where I'm sort of, without fully applying multiculturalism theory, I'm sort of drawing on some aspects of it. I'm trying to see how this hospitality can be mediated. That's why I'm talking about mediated forms of hospitality, how minority groups actually contribute to these processes by being once in this sort of situation themselves and trying to improve experience for others. I think that's sort of where I was trying to come into these debates.
So the notion of hospitality, I think that the three witnesses you point out aren't necessarily weaknesses of hospitality. There's another weakness of hospitality where I think recognition has something to say, but not one of the three that you mentioned. But I think this is also partly because if you look at sociological literature, and the way hospitality is picked up and used in sociological literature is almost exclusively in migration studies, or even more specifically in political asylum seekers and refugees. But then if you look at what Bretherton does with the term, it actually conceives it in a way that it's not a temporary relationship, because he's talking about context and conditions of living in a plural society. It's not about, I mean, you can apply it and use that to think, but he's kind of talking about a diverse plural society with these deep differences. And it's so the kind of relationship isn't temporary in the kind of same sense of migration and asylum seekers and this kind of stuff. And actually the way he kind of conceives it and how he develops it in relation to a discussion of coming out of the New Testament and the example of Jesus specifically is actually it's kind of subverts these kind of power relations. It's deliberately one that tries to subvert the power relations. That when we think hospitality, you traditionally think guest, host, guest, and this kind of stuff come in under these conditions, now get out. You can have that, no, don't go over there, touch that, and this kind of stuff. But it's conceived in a way that subverts this kind of thing, and quite deliberately, and is about relating across different and plural societies. So I think the way of conceiving it, those aren't necessarily weaknesses of the way it's conceived in that specific sense that Bretherton develops. But I think, yeah, the way it gets picked up in sociological literature and used there's all sorts of stuff going on there where those are kind of issues. But I think those are kind of different uses of the notion that have kind of developed kind of separately as well. I think the weakness of hospitality, and this is something that Luke Bretherton, as an example, is completely upfront about and aware of, is that, of course, because it's been developed for him within a faith tradition, within Christianity, and other religious traditions develop their own notions. There might be differences, and these will have to come to the table as part of this kind of stuff. So, of course, you know, the notion of hospitality itself, in some ways, becomes bounded, even if something big can be worked out. And that's why I think kind of multicultural recognition kind of has a greater, or kind of has the kind of scope to come into play with that kind of stuff. I think that's the kind of weakness I suppose I would highlight, shining the light the other way. Yeah.
I think, yeah, Dan.
Just kind of bouncing off that point and that question, really. Yeah, I mean, I'm so keen to ask your opinions on. Yeah, I mean, you know, if we sort of bear in mind those potential problems with the concept of hospitality, what work could hospitality be doing for, you know, beyond? Yeah, I mean, sure, we could think about sort of like personal reward, feeling like people are doing a good thing, they're helping others, but in terms of yeah, people, you know, the hosting. What other, I suppose, sociological benefits might there be? Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
Yeah. This is more for you. I think.
That's more for you. Okay. So I think, thank you for the question. And in terms of the benefits for, are you thinking in terms of benefits for the whole sort of more sociological benefits in terms of the?
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder, you know, are there, yeah, if we think about the way that, you know, othering work, you know, are there benefits for hosts in helping a host to feel to have more ownership and stake in the wider society? You know, thinking particularly about yeah, your work with Muslim and Jewish groups who you know, who have been othered and ostracized. You know, can that is acting as a host a form of, I suppose, claiming claiming citizenship in some sense, you know, not in a legal sense, but in a wider definition.
I guess it's sort of reconfirming their own, in some ways reconfirming their own position within the society, their own role of no longer probably feeling as far as a minority as the group of refugees, newcomers that they are supporting and helping, so having a slightly different sort of status. But I think there's some sort of maybe more, maybe the way to split it is more sort of altruistic benefits and more sort of selfish benefits. In terms of altruistic, it's about building further relations with other groups and other communities. So as I mentioned, a lot of this work is sort of intercommunal and interfaith. So by bringing your own voice to these sort of conversations and your own way of practices and working together with others creates, at least in theory, sort of it's supposed to develop the intercommunal relation, particularly within an area or sort of a local neighborhood within which these sort of connections happen and unfold. Sort of taking the idea of intercommunal sort of micro relations, which are often talked about in everyday multiculturalism on one-to-one level, taking this more into the level of organizations and how organizations interact. And on the other hand, also sort of perhaps a more selfish benefit. Quite often in the research, organizations mention that this work actually helps them to build ties within their own communities. So for example, when an organization organized a community sponsorship group, or they were doing a big collection, or they were running food bank services actually within their place of worship, what happened, of course, that more people joined in, and people perhaps who've never been to a mosque, who've never been to a synagogue, suddenly were coming in and getting and engaging in sort of civic action, yes, but within that sort of religious space, or even and learning more about religion, learning more about their organization and community. And so some respondents actually commented on that as a positive value of these interactions.
A way of having better PR with the public.
Yes, as well. And showing that, you know, your community is not, you know, it's not self-isolating, you know, it's not just helping, for example, a mosque is not just helping Muslim refugees.
Prevent strategy that they have on Muslim, and in turn, maybe showing them that actually we are inclusive and
yes, exactly. And so I think that's what I meant in terms of working in joint ways with other groups and showing that everybody can access the services, that it's not just limited to a particular religion, particular community.
Good, thank you. So I think we can draw this session to a close. Thank you very much for all of those of you who joined us online, and some of you I know are still present. I hope you'll join us for our next and future sessions as well. Thank you for those who came here, and above all, let's show our thank you to Katya and Cummins.